Thank you for the introduction, Will. And as you mentioned, I'm a second year PhD student in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and I also work with the Collections and Culture Unit at the Natural History Museum. I'm really pleased to be on this panel. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I'd also like to very briefly thank my supervisor, Dr. Matthew Davies in Cambridge, as well as Richard Sabin, Dr. Simon Loader, and Dr. Isabel Davies at the Natural History Museum for all their generous advice and support with accessing the museum's collections. So for my talk today, I'd like to begin with a brief example. In 1902, the Natural History Museum advised that the greatest principle its collectors or operators should bear in mind is to make as few incisions as possible in the skin, which should be confined to the middle line under the surface of the body and to the inner sides of the limbs. If attended to, this method ensured the slits would be but little conspicuous when the specimens were mounted. Because collecting depended on the labour and expertise of numerous porters, gun bearers, scouts, skinners, and field dressers, the NHM also advised its collectors to be aware that Muslim skinners had a practice of cutting the throats of animals from ear to ear in order that they may be bled after the orthodox fashion, which would often result in the region of the throat being disfigured by ugly seams. If we compare the NHM's handbook to specimens collected from the Swahili coast by Sir John Kirk, who was the British consul in Zanzibar, these unsightly seams are clearly visible. By the 1910s and 1920s, however, few specimens show seams like these on their fronts. Collectors became more conscientious about their skinning practices, and with handbooks like these, preparation styles became increasingly standardized. Today, I'll present a portion of my PhD research which deals with this politics of specimen preparation. My PhD more widely investigates how natural history museums shape nature conservation in East Africa, and here I'll make the argument that the creation of objects in the field was a material enactment of the politics of the game reserve. At the end of this presentation, I intend to show how museum galleries influenced early legislation on game reserves in East Africa. So game reserves have always been tied in a way to the regulation of collecting practices. The Convention of 1933 was one of the first international agreements for biodiversity conservation. First, I'll give a quick overview of its policy. The convention had two main components. First, the species scheduling system, and secondly, the regulation of hunting methods. Its scheduling system involved two classes. Class A covered species of special urgency and importance. These could only be killed in order to further important scientific purposes. Species in Class B, quote, shall not be hunted, killed, or captured even by natives except under special license, end quote. The special license was similar to a slightly more specialized hunting license. The species listed in red here also show the species which were mentioned in the NHM handbook under, quote, skins of large mammals more urgently needed for the store and study series. Collecting these species was seen as the prime way to conserve them, as it was often the same hunters and naturalists who regularly collected these specimens who were the ones who pushed most ardently for their conservation. In this regard, the convention also limited specific hunting practices. It banned the use of nets, pits, enclosures, gins, and snares. John MacKenzie called this an essentially outright banning of the hunting practices used by Africans in favour of weapons used more commonly by Europeans, like the rifle. The species scheduling system reinforced this technological hierarchy. The important scientific purposes justifying Class A collecting meant that in practice, those using the right kind of technology, namely rifles, could bypass these regulations. Their collecting of hunting trophies was more likely to be deemed a contribution to science than, for example, subsistence hunting using a trap. Rifles were framed as more scientific because a clean shot would ensure a clean skin. So conservation under this convention was closely linked to the technology used to kill an animal, which was itself tied to maintaining the visual integrity of an animal, something essential to its use as a specimen. So if visual integrity was an important mark of something like sportsmanship, exhibitions like Game Animals of the Empire were how you could show off your carefully prepared trophy. Game Animals was a spontaneous and temporary exhibition in the NHM's Whale Hall. The idea for this exhibition came from the assistant keeper of zoology, John Guy Dolman, in October 1931. It had turned out at the time that the Department of Zoology did not have enough funds to install Percy Stamwitz's famous cetacean models in their purpose-built and recently opened whale hall. The exhibition therefore only took 7 months to prepare, and it was on display for just under 10 months, between May 30th, 1932 and March 19th, 1933. In terms of the number of specimens then, this exhibition is one of the largest in the museum's history. Contrary to a lot of the principles of the Index Museum, Game Animals was arranged by geographic distribution and presented many representatives of the same species over and over again. It featured 200 mounted taxidermy specimens grouped into 3 regions: the Indo-Malay Peninsula, Canada, Newfoundland, and Africa. The Africa section was twice the size as the latter two. and the exhibition also featured 500 mounted taxidermy heads distributed across the wall. I fortunately found in the archives Dolman's sketch of game animals of the Empire on the back of a letter dated a few months after the opening. You can see from the letter that Dolman centers the biggest game animals, like the kudu, eland, and buffalo, and smaller species circle out in an arc-like orbit of descending size. The sketch to me appears to highlight how Dolman employed each specimen as objects of aesthetic appreciation in their own right, and he also seemed to continuously redesign the exhibition as it went on. So in this talk, I will explore how the use of aesthetics in game animals linked to the 1933 convention. The photograph on the left shows delegates to the convention with some taxidermy a few months after the exhibition closed. Game animals featured several specimens donated by prominent conservationists, like Edward North Buxton, for example, who was a key advocate for the convention. The visitor guide to game animals also supported the creation of game reserves. It contrasted the British Empire as a force for conservation with the destructive potential of agriculture and commercial exploitation. William Thomas Coleman, the keeper of zoology at the time, pushed back against the idea that it was hunters who were the causes of species decline. As he says in the preface to the visitor guide, with the spread of civilization, many of these fine animals are doomed to disappear. It should be pointed out that the chief agent in this extermination has rarely been the sportsman. The extension of agriculture and, more regrettably, the commercial exploitation of certain animals have been far more destructive. Game animals then sought to show how hunters were the true agents of conservation. As he states, in many parts of empire, great efforts are now being made by the establishment of nature reserves to preserve at least a remnant of the original fauna. So as his photograph suggests, trophy specimens were utilized as part of diplomatic summits and public performances around the convention. What was the role of these specimens? Did their displays contribute to the convention, and how? Having set the scene about the importance of hunting practices, technologies, and visual cultures, I'll now assess the way specimens on display could have an impact on conservation legislation. Okay, how do I do this? I use the idea of a chain operatoire, or an operational chain. This approach is similar to network analysis, but instead of looking just at the circulation of specimens, I treat the network more like a supply chain. I stress how different material practices at different points gave rise to particular relationships between this network's actors. I call this overall the technical system of specimen production, and I break it down into 7 phases. First, the choice of animal in the field, then the acts of field dressing and skinning, short-term transport, and then long-haul shipping, the process of mounting, display, and then eventual arrival in the museum. Not all specimens would directly go on display at the NHM. Some may have entered the research collection, some may have gone on display first, then entered the research collections, and others move between these categories multiple times. My focus, however, is on how specimens in Phase 7 in either category link to those in Phase 1. How did the specimens on display condition the choices collectors made in the field? Was there a kind of reciprocity between these phases over time? And if so, how do we conceive of the NHM's impact as an agent within the system? So, how do I test out this reciprocity between collecting and gallery? I chose one section of the NHM's mammal collection, which, as you can see, contains a wide range of specimen styles from all over the museum's history. It includes most extant mammals that have ever been on display in the museum's galleries from the African continent. I break these down into 7 categories. Description, morphology, which is like the structure, shape, and size. Taphonomy, which is changes to the animal body after death, the materials out of which a specimen are made, its conditions and decoration, and also the way it's been conserved or altered as a museum object once in the museum itself. With around 50 attributes for one specimen, this allows me to identify all material traces pertaining to each chapter in a specimen's object biography. When put into a matrix, these attributes reveal changes in material cultures of specimen making over time. The remainder of my talk will draw from my first analyses of this data. So, for example, this graph shows the distribution of collecting localities from specimens I was able to provenance. It shows that the majority of specimens came from Kenya, followed by Sudan, Somalia, Zambia, South Africa, and Tanzania. This is unsurprising since these were the prime hunting grounds for 19th and 20th century sportsmen in East Africa. The picture becomes much clearer, however, if I also show you these collection localities distributed over time. I graphed the number of specimens collected per year by location, and you can see that Kenya, in red, became central from 1897 onwards. There are very interesting trends here that I don't think I have time to go into properly, but they form a big portion of the rest of my PhD. But the main takeaway that is significant for this paper is that collecting followed trends in popularity, And at the turn of the century, there was a shift from Southern Africa into East Africa and Kenya specifically. So, as collectors targeted one location, so too did they target specific species. The most common species I catalogued was the African buffalo, with 111 separate representatives, the common eland with 76, and the greater kudu with 64. Interestingly, these are exactly the three species that Darwin centered in his sketch of game animals of the empire. They are the largest, most impressive, and most commonly hunted kind of fair game mammal. Most of these species are in the forms of skulls and horns, as shown in these photographs, which suggests they were mostly collected, at least initially, as hunting trophies. It is also unsurprising then that the specimens turn out to be overwhelmingly male. Natalie Cooper, for example, has shown how this is the case in bird collections, where collectors prioritized the males because of their more distinct and aesthetically pleasing plumage. Publications like Roland Ward's Records of Big Game also spurred on competitive forms of collecting and the display of mammal specimens based on their horn size. There are so many iterations of the same ungulate species because hunters sought to acquire the best and biggest record specimens. In search of these record specimens, collectors then began to emphasize a particular part of the animal body, the head and horns. Most specimens from Eastern Africa, Tanzania and Kenya specifically, are in the form of a mounted taxidermy head. Collecting just the head, then, was a convenient way of indicating the size of the whole animal without having to mount or transport the rest of the body. This kind of mounted head gave rise to its own complex set of techniques with particular material cultural meanings. Shields produced by the taxidermist company Roland Ward, for example, were a recognizable image of the brand in themselves. The trident shield, which I catalogued as Roland Ward No. 1, makes the specimen immediately recognizable as a Ward mount. These shields were designed to always make the specimen look evenly centered, and so they were especially popular and fed into the idea of ornamentation. These shields were these ivory plaques also, like the one shown here, also act as a kind of Roland Ward mark of authenticity. Specimens in museum galleries then were essentially advertisements for taxidermy services, and so visitors were encouraged to go out, collect, and prepare their own trophies, reproducing this exact same style. We can also see that Ward's influence in making these trophy heads extended into the activity of the game reserve. In his Handbook for Sportsmen, Ward instructed collectors to only make field incisions around the cape, that is the scalp and the back of the head, rather than down the neck. He complained that previously, so many heads had arrived in deplorable conditions due to inadequate packing and dressing, and customers could not expect these skins to be mounted. As horns are heavy, being able to pull back the skin over a kind of synthetic skull was essential to fix the specimen back to the shield. Roland Ward also designed a kind of internal armature to distribute the weight of the horns and cantilever the specimen against the shield. Both his shields then and this internal armature were his specialized designs, and his instructions became increasingly sacrosanct. The success of later phases of specimen production then depended on if collectors had made the right crucial incisions at the very point of collection. So I now return to the politics of preparation. This backdrop of the cultural capital associated with the trophy heads actively shaped technological hierarchies in the field. Seams visible on the front of Kirk specimens, for instance, gave way towards style of binding located around the horns, shown on this later kudu from Kenya in 1912. These changes show a move to conceal artificial elements of collecting. Ward, for instance, heavily pointed out the wrong ways to prepare a specimen. In a later handbook, he warned against allowing native servants to use lime, which was sure to fade the original color of the specimen. If colors faded a specimen, it would lose its authenticity as a representative of the species. These hierarchies were also based on maintaining the visual integrity of the specimen, not only to ensure accuracy, but also in a sense to conceal the extent to which the hunter engaged with the dead animal body before it was ultimately reanimated in a more lifelike pose by the taxidermist. On the left, for instance, you see Ward's recommendations for the tools collectors should carry for these purposes. In many collecting guides, like with these tools, there are clear surgical parallels. Where hunters are depicted as detached, precise, and objective, the skinning done by Muslim field dressers, in contrast, as seen in the NHM's handbook, is described in terms of gashes and damage. In an earlier passage, the NHM handbook, as I showed at the beginning, refers to these specifically as ugly and disfigured, and Ward also calls them unsightly. So these techniques are again placed in a specifically visual aesthetic hierarchy. The hunter's claim to scientific knowledge was made by how well their material practices were conducive to visual consumption. Consumption of an animal for food, in contrast, was seen as this other end of the spectrum of legitimate hunting. Specimen preparation presented in these guidebooks was almost a medical procedure, a dissection, or a kind of act of plastic surgery. The game reserve, in this sense, it could be seen as a cousin of the 19th century anatomical lecture theatre, wherein one, a surgeon, could perform his expert techniques, so too could the hunter take on the role of a healer or a conserver of these animals, even as he cut them open and sealed them up again, as if never having been there. Tracing and re-identifying these kind of material practices is important because they can be self-perpetuating. Game Animals of the Empire is one of the only exhibitions that I know of that actively spurred on collecting and then introduced those same collections into the same exhibition while it was running. As I mentioned, the exhibition opened on May 30th, 1932, but in the museum's archives I found 2 letters which showed J.G. Dorman received further contributions from well-known sportsmen. One lion encased in glass was also mounted by Roland Ward and donated by Gilbert Blaine in June of that year and was placed at the entrance of the Whale Hall. A further set of 9 East African trophy heads were donated by a Major Payne Galway in November, which were also promptly added to the exhibition. A quarter of all the mounted heads amongst the specimens I assessed were donated in 1932. The NHM then was perhaps caught in somewhat of a snowball effect. As more record specimens arrived, collectors were incentivized and motivated to outdo one another, and each donation reinforced this specific aesthetic of what the prime specimen should look like, which reified the entire technical system from phase 7 to phase 1, and in that sense enacted the entire economy of the game reserve in the museum gallery. So, to conclude, I've argued that specimen making in the field operated as a kind of material enactment of the politics of the game reserve, where we can see how material hierarchies and different techniques of production tied very much to the kind of teleological endpoint of the specimen towards visual consumption. In that sense, I've tried to show that there was a clear reciprocity between collecting in the field and the museum gallery. We also see the dependency of European collectors on non-Western expertise and practices, which interestingly enough they sometimes sought to conceal, but were nevertheless increasingly reliant on. The material traces of these different collectors in early specimens, and then also evidence of how these traces became increasingly absent as skinning practices become standardized, can give us some insight into the changing social relationships that were structured by these material practices. Finally, then, I've also shown how specimens are deeply insightful material cultural sources in themselves that can be read along archives, but also specifically in the absence of archives and named collectors, there's a lot we can glean just from the specimen itself. Prying apart the seams of the specimens, metaphorically and literally, can then help us tell weightier stories of histories of collecting, conservation, and display, and reveal how museum exhibitions, as I seek to do with the remainder of my PhD, came to matter in the making of East African game reserves. Thank you.